Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's tale begins, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. The Boy in the Box, an unsolved murder case, also known as America's Unknown Child, is one of those stories that never really leaves you once you hear it. It doesn't rely on jump scares or dramatic twists. It stays with you because of how quiet it is, how unresolved it feels, and how many questions were never answered. If you take the time to really sit with it, it becomes less about the crime itself and more about absence. The absence of a name, the absence of a family stepping forward, the absence of truth. Police found a young boy inside a cardboard box. He was dead when they found him. The location where he was discovered was not somewhere hidden, deep away from the world, which somehow made it worse. He had been placed there deliberately, not dumped carelessly, not thrown aside. Someone had taken time. Someone had made choices. When investigators examined his body, they noticed something that immediately complicated the story. Despite the obvious fact that he had been killed, his body had signs of care. His nails had been recently trimmed. His skin was clean. He didn't look like a child who had been neglected for a long time. There were marks and scars on his body. But they weren't the kind that came from living on the street or being abandoned to the elements. They suggested harm, but not chaos. There was order in what had been done to him, and that made it even more disturbing. His hair had been shaved. That detail alone raised countless questions. Why shave a child's hair? Was it done to hide something? Was it done as part of control? Was it done after death or before? No one could say for sure. The shaved hair became one of many details that suggested intention without explanation. The scars found on his body were another source of deep concern. They were not random. They were specific. They suggested that the child had suffered. The exact nature of those injuries made it clear that he had been harmed over time, not just in a single moment. But even with that, investigators struggled to determine the exact cause of death. Early theories included a severe head injury, but nothing fully explained everything they were seeing. What made the case especially haunting was the sense that this boy had belonged to someone. He was not a child no one cared about. His trimmed nails suggested routine. His clean body suggested someone had bathed him. These small, ordinary details pointed toward a life that had structure at some point. A life that had rules. A life that had, at least briefly, been watched over. That raised the biggest question of all. If he had a family, where were they? The police and detectives threw themselves into the investigation. They started with the most obvious clue they had: the box. The cardboard box the boy had been found in was not generic. It was a specific kind of box, distributed by a particular company. That meant there was a paper trail. Investigators tracked down the manufacturer and learned that only a small number of those boxes had been sold in the area. About a dozen, give or take. They tracked down every single person who had purchased one. Each person was questioned carefully. Names were checked, stories were compared, alibis were examined. None of them knew who the boy was. None of them admitted to recognizing him. And none of them could explain how he might have ended up in that box. It was a dead end. Investigators then expanded their search. They began looking at foster homes and families in the surrounding area. One particular foster family drew attention because of how close they lived to where the boy was found. When police searched their home, they found a crib. The presence of a crib raised alarms. Why have a crib if there was no young child living there? The family was questioned. They denied knowing the boy. They denied having cared for him. They denied any involvement. There was no direct evidence tying them to the child, and without that, the investigation stalled again. As days passed, more unsettling details emerged. It turned out that at least 2 people had seen the boy's body before police officially found him. On 2 separate days, 2 different individuals had noticed the box and looked inside. One of them did nothing. They saw the child and walked away. The other eventually reported it, but only after a full day had passed. That knowledge shook investigators and the public alike. The idea that someone could see a dead child and not immediately contact authorities was horrifying. It added another layer of silence and failure to the story. Another chance missed. Another moment where intervention didn't come. Inside the box, there was also a blue hat. The hat became a major focus of the investigation. It wasn't mass-produced. It had been made by a small business. That meant it could be traced. The woman who had made the hat was located and questioned. She remembered it. She said it had been custom-made for a man who had ordered it specifically. She gave the police his name. Investigators tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. They asked him about the hat. They asked him about the boy. They asked him if he recognized the description or the photographs. He denied everything. He said he had no idea what they were talking about. He didn't know the boy. He didn't know how the hat ended up in the box. There was no evidence strong enough to prove otherwise. No witnesses. No physical proof tying him directly to the crime. Once again, the trail went cold. As time went on, leads dried up. Tips came in, but none of them held up under scrutiny. People called in claiming to recognize the boy. Some said he looked like a neighbor's child. Others said he resembled someone they had once known. Each lead was investigated, and each one collapsed under closer examination. Eventually, the case slowed to a crawl. The police and detectives did not officially declare it closed, but the active pursuit faded. Resources were redirected. New cases took priority. The boy remained unidentified. The file grew thicker, but no closer to resolution. What makes this case so painful is not just that a child was murdered, but that he was erased. No name, no confirmed family, no one stepping forward to say they missed him, no one claiming him. That silence is louder than any scream. People often assume that every child belongs to someone who would notice if they disappeared. This case challenges that assumption in the most brutal way possible. Whether his family was abusive, ashamed, fearful, or involved, the result was the same. He vanished without a trace, and no one spoke up. Over time, the story of the boy in the box became something larger than the case itself. It became a symbol of all the children who fall through the cracks, children who are harmed behind closed doors, children whose lives end quietly, without justice or recognition. The public didn't forget him, even if the system eventually did. People left toys and flowers near where he was found. Artists sketched what he might have looked like alive. Writers and investigators revisited the case again and again, hoping that time might reveal something new. But for decades, nothing did. What's especially unsettling is how many clues existed, and how none of them were enough. The box, the hat, the foster home, the witnesses who delayed reporting. Each piece felt like it should have led somewhere. Instead, they formed a circle, always bringing investigators back to the same unanswered questions. Who was he? Where did he come from? Who hurt him? Why was he never claimed? The idea that the case simply faded into history without resolution is hard to accept. It leaves you with the feeling that something essential was missed. That somewhere, someone knew the truth and chose not to speak. That's why the story still scares people today. Not because of gore or spectacle, but because of what it says about invisibility, about how a child can exist, suffer, and die and still remain unknown. It forces you to confront uncomfortable realities, that systems fail, that silence protects harm, that justice is not guaranteed. The boy in the box is remembered not for who he was, but for what was done to him. That is a tragedy in itself. He deserved a name. He deserved to be known. He deserved someone to fight for him. Instead, he became a question mark that history still hasn't erased. And maybe that's why people continue to tell his story. Not to scare, but to remember, to refuse to let him disappear completely, to hold on to the hope that someday, even decades later, the truth might finally come out. Until then, he remains America's unknown child. Recently in my country, something happened that shook a lot of people, including me, because it showed how tragedy can come from places that were meant to provide safety. An elderly married couple, quiet people who lived alone, were attacked by their own pitbull. The dog was not a stray or an animal raised for aggression. It was a gift from their daughter. She had given it to them because she worried about their safety and wanted them to feel protected in their home. That intention, born out of love and concern, is what makes the entire story so painful. One day, without warning, the dog turned on them. The woman died at the scene. The man survived the initial attack, but was badly injured and taken to intensive care. For days, doctors tried to save him, but his body could not recover. He died in the ICU shortly afterward. Two lives were gone, and the house that had once been quiet and familiar became the center of grief, shock, and unanswered questions. The saddest part, beyond the loss itself, is what this did to their daughter. She is the co-worker of my sister, and through that connection, we heard how deeply broken she is. She lives with a crushing sense of guilt, even though none of this was her fault. She gave her parents the dog because she loved them. She wanted them to feel safe, not knowing that the very thing meant to protect them would become the cause of their deaths. That kind of guilt is heavy and unfair, but it doesn't disappear just because logic says it shouldn't be there. This story is terrifying, not because it's dramatic or violent in a sensational way, but because it shows how unpredictable life can be. Something meant to offer comfort and security can, under the wrong circumstances, become dangerous. It forces you to think about how little control we truly have, even when our intentions are good and our decisions are made with care. Around the same time, I was already in a bad mental space. I had gone through a phase where I was watching disturbing content online. The kind of stuff you look at out of morbid curiosity and then regret deeply. Videos and stories about cartel violence, executions, and confessions from people who had lived inside that world. It's the kind of material that stays with you, even when you wish it wouldn't. One story in particular still disturbs me to this day. It was about the confession of a former sicario, someone who had worked as a hired killer for a cartel. He spoke about many things he had done, But what stood out was what he said he regretted the most. This wasn't someone trying to justify himself or make excuses. If anything, he sounded hollow, like someone who had already accepted that there was no redemption waiting for him. He described an incident involving a drug dealer who had stolen money. The punishment wasn't quick. It wasn't just about killing the person responsible. It was about sending a message through cruelty. The man and his wife were captured and tied up. They were forced to watch as harm was done to their children. The children were very young. The oldest was only 7. The details he shared were horrifying, not because of graphic imagery, but because of the intention behind it. The suffering was deliberate. It was slow. It was meant to break the parents completely before killing them too. The former Sicario described the father's screams, comparing them to an animal, not as an insult, but as an expression of raw, uncontrollable pain that no human should ever experience. Even now, writing about it without going into detail makes my chest feel tight. What makes this story so disturbing is not just the violence, but the complete absence of humanity. Children were used as tools to punish adults. Innocence meant nothing. Life meant nothing. It was violence for the sake of dominance, fear, and control. The man telling the story admitted that no matter how much he tried to bury it, that moment never left him. Out of everything he had done, that was the one that haunted him the most. And it haunts me too, even though I was never there, even though I only read about it. These two stories, so different on the surface, are connected by something deeper. They both show how suffering can come from places we don't expect, and how the consequences ripple outward far beyond the moment itself. In the first story, love unintentionally led to tragedy. In the second, cruelty was intentional and calculated. One was an accident shaped by circumstances, the other a deliberate act of evil. But both leave behind people who are broken in ways that can't easily be fixed. The daughter who gave her parents the dog will never forget what happened. The former Sicario will never forget what he did. The parents in that Cartel story never had a chance to forget anything at all. What scares me the most is how these things exist in the same world we live in. On one street, a quiet elderly couple is killed by the very thing meant to protect them. Somewhere else, families are destroyed as part of criminal punishment, far from the eyes of most people, but just as real. It makes the world feel unstable, like safety is fragile and easily torn apart. I still think about these stories years later. They surface at night, or when something reminds me of them unexpectedly. They've changed the way I look at protection, violence, and responsibility. They've also made me more aware of how important mental health is, not just for victims, but for everyone touched by trauma. Guilt, grief, and horror don't just disappear with time. They settle in and change people. These stories disturb me because they don't feel distant or fictional. They feel close. They feel possible. And that's what makes them hard to forget. This one is scary to me, not because it feels distant or unreal, but because it shows how fragile normal life can be, and how easily something catastrophic can happen inside an ordinary family. My family. It highlights the deep and painful lack of mental health care in this country, and how when support systems fail, the consequences can be irreversible. In the tangled branches of our extended family tree, there was a young man who had been ill for a long time. He lived with paranoid schizophrenia. That phrase alone doesn't really capture what his life was like, or what it was like for the people who loved him. He wasn't born violent. He wasn't born broken. We watched him grow up. He was a real kid with a real personality. He laughed, argued, got in trouble sometimes, and pushed boundaries the way many kids do. He was a good kid, even if he could be stubborn and defiant at times. As he got older, the illness took more hold. There were periods when he was stable, and periods when he wasn't. He went in and out of care. On medication, off medication, hospitalized, then released. Each cycle took a little more out of him and out of his family. Anyone who has lived alongside severe mental illness knows how exhausting it is, how hopeful you become during the good stretches, and how devastating it is when things start slipping again. For a while, things really did seem to be improving. Several years ago, he reached a point where his parents felt comfortable enough to let him live independently. They owned a small house about 20 minutes from their own home, and they helped him get set up there. He was stable. He had a job. He was functioning in the world. For his parents, it must have felt like a miracle, or at least a fragile victory. Proof that all the years of effort and fear and advocacy had not been for nothing. But mental illness doesn't follow a straight line. As happens to many people with serious psychiatric conditions, he stopped taking his medication. Sometimes it's because of side effects. Sometimes it's because the illness convinces the person they don't need it. Sometimes it's both. Whatever the reason, the result is often the same. Symptoms return, often stronger than before. His parents noticed something was wrong and drove over to check on him. They realized very quickly that he was not okay and that he needed to be hospitalized again. This was not new territory for them. They had done this before. They believed, as parents do, that they could help him through it. They tried to get him into the car. What they were facing, though, was not just their son. He was in the middle of a full psychotic break. His reality was not the same as theirs. Fear, paranoia, and confusion had taken over. But his parents didn't see a threat. They saw their child in pain. They saw the boy they had raised, not the illness that had hijacked his mind. His father tried to physically guide him into the car, to muscle him a little, the way parents sometimes do when they are desperate and out of options. And that was the moment everything broke. The son lashed out. He stabbed his father in the neck with a pocket knife. As his wife tried to help, tried to save him, tried to call 911, the situation escalated beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The son got hold of a pistol and shot his father, killing him. That man did not deserve to die like that. We were very different people in many ways, but there was no denying the kind of person he was. He was the type of man who showed up. When his daughter and son-in-law struggled with addiction and jail time, he stepped in and took care of his grandkids. He didn't talk about doing the right thing. He did it. He was the kind of person who put his money where his mouth was. Church every Sunday. Overtime shifts whenever they were offered. Responsibility wasn't something he talked about, it was something he lived. And in that moment, he must have been terrified, hurt, confused, heartbroken. To be attacked by your own child, a child you were trying to help, is a level of betrayal and fear that's hard to even imagine. It's not a failure of love. It's the collision of love and illness in a system that offers too few protections. The aftermath was devastating. The son will never get out of prison. His life, whatever it might have been, is effectively over. Not because he was born evil, but because his illness was not adequately treated and contained. His mother will never be the same. No one could be. She lost her husband and her son in the same moment, in different ways. One to death, the other to a system that locks people away instead of helping them before it's too late. His siblings, his children, his grandchildren all carry this trauma now. It doesn't go away. It shows up at holidays and quiet moments, in conversations that trail off because no one knows what to say. It becomes part of the family's permanent emotional landscape. People often ask why his parents didn't just put him in a mental hospital. That question comes from a place of misunderstanding. There aren't many mental hospitals anymore. Long-term inpatient care is incredibly difficult to access. Insurance in the United States often doesn't cover adequate mental health treatment, especially for severe and chronic conditions. Families are left juggling medications, short hospital stays, emergency interventions, and constant fear, all while trying to hold on to some version of normal life. It creates a terrible, self-reinforcing cycle. People who need help don't get it. Their conditions worsen. They end up homeless, incarcerated, or dead. Prisons become de facto mental health facilities, even though they are completely unequipped to provide proper care. Families are blamed for not doing enough, even when the resources they're being told to use don't exist or are financially out of reach. This is not a rare story. It's happening all over the country, quietly, behind closed doors, until it erupts into something the public can't ignore. Then people ask how it could have happened, as if it appeared out of nowhere. The truth is, it builds over years. The problem will get worse before it gets better. The demand for mental health care is growing, and the infrastructure to support it is not keeping up. Many people don't understand the urgency of the issue until it touches them personally, until it's their family, their street, their loved one. That's what terrifies me the most. Not just the violence, but the inevitability of more stories like this if nothing changes. The idea that families will keep being placed in impossible situations, forced to choose between inadequate options, hoping love will be enough to bridge the gap where systems have failed. This story isn't about blaming a sick man or glorifying a tragedy. It's about acknowledging how broken the system is and how much damage that brokenness causes. It's about recognizing that mental illness is not a moral failing and that ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It's scary because it could happen to anyone, any family. And until there is real investment, real care, and real understanding, these tragedies will keep repeating, quietly, predictably, and devastatingly. That in the middle of the night, just a few months ago, something happened that still doesn't feel real to me, even now. It wasn't some distant news story from another state or another country. It wasn't something I heard about years later in passing. It happened close enough that it changed the way I think about normal nights, familiar sounds, and how easily horror can exist right next to you without announcing itself. I was staying in Texas at the time, in a quiet area where nights usually blended together. Roads were nearby, cars passed through at all hours, and the sounds of engines and tires on asphalt were just part of the background. You stop noticing them after a while. They become white noise, something your brain filters out so you can relax. 2 roads away from where I was staying, a woman murdered her 3 young children. The details are unbearable, and yet they are real. According to the police report, she drugged all 3 of her kids. They were small, young enough to trust her completely, young enough to have no idea what was happening or why. After drugging them, she took them outside in the middle of the night. The streets were dark. Most people were asleep. The world was quiet in that hollow, late-night way. She placed her children in the middle of the road. Then she got into her SUV. What she did next is something I struggle to even put into words. She sped around the block and drove over them. Not once, not twice, 5 times. She kept circling back, accelerating, and running over them again and again. By the time it was over, all 3 children were dead. The damage was so severe that parts of their bodies were scattered across the road. The road stayed closed for 4 days. 4 days of cleanup. 4 days of investigation. 4 days before anyone could drive over that stretch of asphalt again. That alone should tell you how extreme the scene was. This wasn't something that could be washed away quickly. It wasn't something that could be erased with a hose and a few hours of work. The part that unsettles me the most is how close I was. I was awake that night. I smoke outside, especially late at night when things are quiet and I can think. I was probably outside at the same time she was doing this. I was standing there, breathing in smoke, listening to the usual sounds of the night, cars speeding by, engines revving, tires on pavement. All things I was used to hearing, and I had no idea. Nothing stood out enough to make me think something was wrong. No screams reached me. No obvious crash. No sudden interruption to the normal rhythm of the night. Just the same familiar sounds I had heard countless times before. The same background noise that had never meant anything until that moment. That realization has stayed with me in a way I can't shake. We like to believe that we would know if something horrible was happening nearby, that we would sense it, hear it, feel it. We imagine danger as loud and unmistakable, something that demands attention. But that night taught me that sometimes the most horrific things happen quietly, hidden inside sounds we've trained ourselves to ignore. When I found out what had happened, it hit me all at once. The image of those roads, the sound of cars passing by. The thought that I might have been standing outside, completely unaware, while 3 children were being murdered just streets away. It made me feel sick. It made me feel small and helpless in a way that's hard to describe. I kept replaying the night in my head, trying to remember if anything had sounded different, trying to recall if there was a moment where I felt uneasy without knowing why. But the truth is, there wasn't. Everything had sounded normal. And that's what scared me the most. Normal is not safe. Normal is just familiar. The idea that something so violent could blend into the background of everyday noise changed how I hear the world. Now, when I hear cars speeding by late at night, I don't just hear cars anymore. I hear the possibility of something else, something hidden, something terrible happening out of sight. I also can't stop thinking about those children. They didn't get a chance. They didn't get a warning. They didn't get to grow up, to make mistakes, to become people with stories of their own. Their lives ended in the most brutal way imaginable, carried out by the one person who was supposed to protect them above all else. People often talk about monsters as if they're something separate from humanity, as if they're rare, obvious, and easy to identify. Stories like this destroy that illusion. This wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in the dark. This was a mother, a person who lived in a house, drove a car, and existed in a community like anyone else. Whatever was happening inside her mind, whatever combination of mental illness, despair, rage, or detachment led to that night, the result was the same. 3 children lost their lives in a way that defies comprehension. I don't know what her neighbors thought when they heard the news. I don't know how the people who live on that road sleep now. I don't know how anyone processes something like that happening in a place that once felt ordinary. I just know that it leaves a scar, even on people who weren't directly involved. The fact that the road was closed for days made it impossible to ignore. Even people who hadn't known the children or the woman were forced to confront what had happened. Traffic rerouted, police tape, cleanup crews. The physical aftermath of violence made visible in a way that words alone never could. And still, the night it happened passed quietly. That contrast is what haunts me. The silence, the ordinariness of it. The way the world kept moving while something unimaginably cruel unfolded just out of sight. It also made me think about how many tragedies we never notice. How many people suffer and die while the rest of us go about our routines, completely unaware. We assume that if something truly awful were happening, it would break through the noise of daily life. But that night proved that assumption wrong. Sometimes horror doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it hides inside familiarity. I think about how easily I could have dismissed any strange sound that night, even if there had been one. How quickly the brain explains things away. A car backfiring, tires screeching, someone driving too fast. We're conditioned to normalize chaos when it's frequent enough. Living near roads teaches you that. You stop reacting, and that's terrifying. Since then, nights feel different. Standing outside doesn't feel as peaceful as it used to, and the sounds of traffic no longer fade into the background so easily. My mind fills in the gaps, imagining things I know I can't see. I don't know if that awareness makes me safer or just more anxious, but it's there now, whether I want it or not. This story scares me, not just because of what happened, but because of what it says about proximity, about how close we can be to unimaginable violence without knowing it, about how thin the line is between ordinary life and unspeakable tragedy. It also forces you to confront how fragile children are, how completely dependent they are on adults, how when that trust is broken, there is nothing they can do to protect themselves. That knowledge sits heavy in the chest and doesn't leave easily. People will analyze this case in terms of mental health, criminal justice, warning signs, and prevention. Those conversations matter. They should happen. But for me, the fear lives somewhere quieter. It lives in the memory of standing outside at night, thinking everything was normal, while something horrific was unfolding nearby. It lives in the realization that the world doesn't pause for tragedy. It lives in the understanding that you don't always hear danger when it's close. That's what makes it terrifying. Not the gore, not the headlines, not even the scale of the violence, as horrific as it was, but the silence around it, the way it blended into the night, the way life continued, unaware, while 3 lives were violently ended. That thought stays with me, and I don't think it ever fully will leave. A woman lived in a rural area in Australia with her husband and their 3 daughters. They were a quiet family, the kind that doesn't draw much attention because life in those places is already quiet by nature. The land around them was wide and open, dotted with sheep and long stretches of fence, the kind of environment where people rely on each other and on practical knowledge passed down through work and routine rather than constant access to specialists or big hospitals. Her husband worked as a sheep farm hand. It was hard, physical work, the kind that leaves you tired at the end of the day, but also gives you a sense of purpose. Their lives were shaped by that rhythm. Early mornings, long days, animals to care for, chores that couldn't be skipped. Their 3 daughters were still young, around 9, 7, and 6 years old. Close in age, close in bond, growing up in a place where siblings often become each other's main companions. Like many families with young children, they eventually ran into a very common problem. The girls got lice. It wasn't unusual, and it wasn't something that caused immediate panic. Head lice are one of those things parents talk about with a mix of annoyance and resignation. Schools send notes home. Parents groan. Treatments are bought. Hair is combed. Life moves on. It's uncomfortable, unpleasant, but not usually dangerous. In this case, though, everything went terribly wrong. Her husband brought home a bottle of lice treatment, but it wasn't meant for people. It was a chemical treatment used for sheep. On farms, these kinds of products are everywhere. They're used regularly, trusted within that context, and handled without much second thought because they're part of the job. Over time, familiarity can blur the line between what is safe for animals and what is safe for humans, especially when access to proper alternatives is limited or misunderstood. The woman didn't realize how dangerous the chemical was. Trying to deal with the lice quickly and thoroughly, she put the girls in the bath. She wet their hair and worked the treatment through, just as countless parents have done with human lice shampoos. To her, it may have felt like she was doing the responsible thing, taking action, solving a problem, protecting her children from discomfort and embarrassment. But the chemical was severely toxic to humans. Within hours, the girls began to show signs that something was wrong. Their small bodies reacted to the poison in ways that no one could stop once it had entered their systems. Panic replaced routine. The parents rushed them to the local hospital, likely hoping and believing that doctors would fix it, that whatever was happening could be reversed. In rural areas, hospitals are often small. Staff do their best, but they don't always have the resources or specialists needed for rare or extreme situations. As the seriousness of the poisoning became clear, the girls were given specialist treatment, but time was already working against them. Despite everything that was done, all 3 girls died within 2 days. 3 children, gone because of a mistake rooted in misunderstanding, access, and a system that failed to protect them before it was too late. The shock of it spread quickly. Stories like this don't stay contained in small communities. They ripple outward, carried by news reports, conversations, and disbelief. People struggled to understand how something so ordinary could turn into something so catastrophic. Lice treatment, a bath, a parent trying to help. And yet, the reality was undeniable. The chemical had never been meant for humans. The warning labels existed, but warnings don't always translate into understanding, especially when people are exhausted, isolated, and used to solving problems themselves. Rural life often requires a level of self-reliance that can become dangerous when it intersects with highly toxic substances. The legal system moved in. The woman and her husband were arrested and are currently in jail, awaiting trial for the deaths of their daughters. The language used is clinical and procedural, but the situation itself is anything but. This is not a story of malice or intentional harm. It is a story of devastating consequences and questions that don't have satisfying answers. People argue about responsibility, about negligence, about whether ignorance can ever excuse harm. Courts will decide guilt or innocence under the law, but those decisions won't bring the girls back. They won't undo the moment when a parent realized something was horribly wrong. They won't erase the sound of hospital machines or the memory of waiting and hoping for a miracle that never came. What makes this story so frightening isn't just the loss of life. It's how ordinary it started. There was no obvious danger at first, no violent intent, no warning that screamed catastrophe. Just a common childhood issue and a product that seemed like a solution. It's terrifying because it shows how easily tragedy can happen when information, access, and support are lacking. It also highlights how vulnerable families in rural areas can be. Distance from proper medical care, limited access to safe products, a reliance on what's available. A culture of handling things yourself because help is far away or slow to arrive. All of those factors quietly increase risk, even when people are doing what they believe is best. Mental health plays a role here too, though it's often overlooked. The weight of responsibility on parents, especially in isolated environments, can lead to rushed decisions, fear of judgment, fear of delay, fear of not acting quickly enough. When something like lice appears, it can feel urgent, especially when children are uncomfortable or being sent home from school. There's also the broader issue of how dangerous substances are stored, labeled, and understood. Farm chemicals are powerful by design. They are meant to kill parasites, insects, and organisms. They are not meant to be used casually or without strict guidelines. But when those products exist in homes, sheds, and work vehicles, the risk of misuse increases. The deaths of those 3 girls have sparked conversations across Australia about safety, education, and accountability, about how to better protect families from making irreversible mistakes, about how to ensure that people understand the risks of the products they use, about whether enough is being done to bridge the gap between rural life and modern healthcare standards. Still, none of that eases the human cost. A mother who will have to live with the knowledge of what happened for the rest of her life. A father who brought home something he never imagined would destroy his family. Grandparents, relatives, and neighbors who watched those girls grow up and now have to reconcile memories of laughter with the reality of loss. People often want stories like this to have a clear villain, someone to hate, someone to blame. But real life doesn't always provide that kind of clarity. Sometimes the villain is a system that doesn't educate well enough. Sometimes it's isolation. Sometimes it's a moment of misunderstanding that spirals into something irreversible. That's what makes this story so deeply unsettling. It forces you to confront how thin the line is between care and harm. How easily good intentions can lead to disaster when the right information isn't there. How parents, who are supposed to protect their children, can become the cause of unimaginable loss without ever meaning to. It also raises uncomfortable questions about how society treats these cases, about punishment versus prevention, about whether jail addresses the root problems or simply adds more suffering to an already broken situation, about how many similar tragedies might be prevented through better education, clearer labeling, and more accessible health care. This didn't happen decades ago. It didn't happen in some distant, less informed time. It happened last month. That fact alone makes it harder to dismiss as something from the past. It's a reminder that these gaps still exist, that people still fall through them, that families can still be destroyed by a single mistake involving something they thought was safe enough to use. What stays with me most is the image of those 3 girls together. Siblings who shared baths, bedrooms, arguments, and secrets. Children who trusted their parents completely. Children whose lives ended not because they were unloved, but because the world around them failed to protect them from a danger they didn't understand. This story is scary because it doesn't feel like a horror movie. There's no masked killer, no obvious threat. Just everyday life, a common problem, and a fatal misunderstanding. And that makes it far more terrifying than anything fictional. Two of my friends once hitchhiked back home from Brisbane to Ipswich, Australia. And even now, years later, the story still feels unreal when I think about it. It's one of those situations where everything seems casual and ordinary at first. And then suddenly the ground drops out from under you and you realize how close you were to something truly horrifying. They were young, broke, and doing what a lot of people did back then without thinking too hard about it. Hitchhiking wasn't something that felt especially dangerous to them at the time. It was just a way to get home without spending money they didn't have. The distance wasn't massive, and they'd done similar things before without incident. In their minds, it was inconvenient, maybe a little risky, but nothing extreme. Eventually, a four-wheel drive pulled over and offered them a lift. From the outside, nothing seemed obviously wrong. The vehicle looked normal enough, and there were multiple people inside, which sometimes makes a situation feel safer rather than more dangerous. They climbed in, settled themselves in the back, and thanked the driver. The engine started up again, and the car merged back onto the road. For the first 20 minutes or so, the drive felt uneventful. There was conversation, the hum of the road beneath the tires, the kind of background noise that lulls you into thinking everything is fine. My friends relaxed a little. They were thinking about getting home, about food, about whatever waited for them at the end of the trip. Nothing in their bodies was screaming danger yet. Then one of the people in the car turned around. He had dreadlocks, and his tone changed completely from whatever casual talk had come before. He looked at them and said, calmly and clearly, that they shouldn't hitchhike with strangers. Then he followed that statement with something far worse. He told them that they were going to kill the two of them. At first, it didn't fully register. When something like that is said so bluntly, the brain tries to protect itself by assuming it's a joke or some kind of sick attempt at humor. My friends exchanged looks, trying to read the room, trying to figure out if this was some twisted way of scaring them for a laugh. But the man didn't laugh. The car kept moving. No one else in the vehicle objected or corrected him. No one told him to shut up. The silence that followed made it clear this wasn't a joke. The air in the car changed. What had felt like an ordinary ride suddenly felt like a trap closing in. Time stretched in a strange way after that. Minutes felt longer. Every sound seemed sharper. My friends became painfully aware of how enclosed the space was, how fast the car was moving, how far they were from help. They were in the middle of a situation they hadn't chosen and couldn't simply step away from. After some more time passed, the same man spoke again. This time, what he said was different, but no less terrifying. He told them that he knew what they wanted and that they were going to pay him for it. He made it clear that he expected money, and he said that they would stop at a service station so he could walk them to an ATM. At that moment, survival instincts took over. My friends didn't argue. They didn't challenge him. They said, okay. Saying yes wasn't agreement. It was strategy. It was buying time. The man explained the plan as if it were already settled. They would pull over at the service station. He would get out with them. They would go to the ATM together. The implication of what would happen after was unspoken but obvious. The earlier threat still hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. As the four-wheel drive slowed down, one of my friends caught the other's eye. It was a look that didn't need words. Years of knowing each other, of reading each other's expressions, condensed into a single moment of understanding. This was their chance. It might be the only one they got. The vehicle decelerated, preparing to turn in. In one sudden burst of movement, my friend acted. He struck the man sitting near them, hitting him hard enough to knock him out of the moment. At the same time, he lashed out at the back door of the vehicle, front-kicking it with everything he had. The lock broke. The door flew open. Before anyone in the front of the car could fully react, both of my friends threw themselves out onto the roadside. They ran. Adrenaline erased exhaustion. Fear erased pain. They didn't look back. They didn't slow down. They ran as if their lives depended on it, because they almost certainly did. Behind them, the four-wheel drive swerved and then corrected itself. The engine roared. The car tried to follow them. My friends split up briefly, ducking between structures and obstacles, using whatever cover they could find. They knew the area better than the people in the car did, and that knowledge mattered. Somehow, through speed, luck, and sheer desperation, they managed to lose the vehicle. They kept running until their lungs burned and their legs shook, until they were sure they weren't being followed anymore. Only then did they stop, bent over, gasping for air, trying to process what had just happened. They were alive. What makes the story even more disturbing is what came afterward. Another guy we knew, completely unrelated to the situation, later told us about something that had happened to him around the same time. A four-wheel drive had pulled up next to him while he was out. The people inside asked him if he had seen two individuals matching my friend's descriptions. He said no. At the time, he had no idea what he was actually refusing to be part of. He didn't know that the people in that vehicle had threatened to kill two hitchhikers. He didn't know they had chased them after they escaped. He thought it was just a strange question from strangers and didn't give it much thought until later. When he eventually heard the full story, it chilled him. If he had answered differently, if he had pointed them in the right direction, the outcome might have been very different. The realization that he had unknowingly played a role in my friend's survival stayed with him for a long time. For my friends, the psychological impact didn't fade quickly. They replayed the moments over and over in their heads. The sound of the man's voice when he made the threat, the way no one else in the car objected. The feeling of the vehicle slowing down. The split-second decision to act. The violence it took to escape. The sound of the engine trying to follow them. It changed how they saw the world. Hitchhiking stopped being a harmless adventure and became something else entirely. Trusting strangers no longer felt neutral. Even everyday interactions took on a sharper edge, colored by the knowledge of how quickly things can turn. What's most frightening about this story isn't just the threat itself, but how easily it happened. There was no elaborate setup, no obvious warning signs at the start. Just a car pulling over, an offer of a ride, and a decision made in a moment of convenience. It's also terrifying how calm the threat was delivered. There was no shouting, no dramatic buildup, just a statement, spoken as if it were a fact. That kind of calm suggests intention, not impulse. It suggests this wasn't the first time those words had been said. The presence of multiple people in the car makes it even worse. It means more than one person was involved or, at the very least, complicit. Silence in that situation isn't neutrality. It's agreement. The story forces you to confront how vulnerable hitchhikers are, how much power they give up the moment they get into a stranger's vehicle. Doors lock. Speed increases. Options disappear. You are no longer in control of where you go or when you stop. For my friends, survival came down to timing, trust in each other, and the willingness to act decisively when the moment came. If the car hadn't slowed when it did, if the door hadn't broken, if either of them had hesitated, the outcome might have been unthinkable. That's what makes this story so hard to shake. It's not just a tale of danger narrowly avoided. It's a reminder of how thin the line can be between an ordinary day and a life-altering trauma. How quickly a casual decision can put you in the path of people who mean you real harm. When people hear this story, they often say things like, "I can't believe that happened," or "That sounds like something out of a movie." But that's part of the problem. We're conditioned to think of horror as something exaggerated or fictional, something that happens elsewhere, to other people. This didn't. It happened on a normal road, between two familiar places, in a situation that felt routine until it wasn't. There were no ominous signs flashing in advance, just the sudden revelation of intent, delivered too late to walk away safely. For me, hearing this story changed how I think about danger. It's not always loud or chaotic. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in the ordinary. Sometimes it sits beside you in the back of a vehicle, always waiting for the right moment to show itself. That's why this is one of the craziest true stories I know. Not because it's unbelievable, but because it's so frighteningly believable. Because two people came within moments of being killed simply for trusting the wrong strangers. Because survival depended on instinct and luck rather than protection or intervention. And because even now, somewhere out there are people who see vulnerability not as something to respect, but as an opportunity. That knowledge alone is enough to make anyone uneasy. It's scary as hell, not in a cinematic way, but in a quiet, lingering way that stays with you long after the story is over. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. When your friend introduces their friend to you, you usually don't think twice about it. You assume there's some level of trust built in. You assume your friend wouldn't knowingly bring someone dangerous or deeply unstable into your life without at least warning you. Most of the time, that assumption is harmless. Sometimes it's not. That's what makes this scary to me, not because of one specific event, but because of the uncertainty and the quiet risk that comes with not knowing who you're really letting into your life. This happened to me more than once, and both times it came through the same friend. This friend had a habit of collecting people who were, for lack of a better word, unstable. At first, I didn't see it as a pattern. I just thought they were being compassionate, open-minded, loyal. It took time and experience to realize that loyalty without boundaries can be dangerous. The first person they introduced me to seemed off from the beginning, but not in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. There was something intense about her. Her emotions were unpredictable, swinging quickly from friendly to withdrawn to hostile. Conversations felt charged, like you had to be careful with every word. Still, mental health issues are common, and not everyone who struggles is dangerous. I try not to judge. Then things escalated. At some point, this person took a knife, went into her friend's room, and intended to kill her. There was no argument in that moment, no clear trigger that made sense to anyone on the outside. It was driven by something internal, something detached from reality. Thankfully, she didn't succeed. She was stopped before anyone was killed, but the intent was real and the danger was immediate. She was later diagnosed with a serious mental disorder. Knowing that after the fact didn't make it less frightening. If anything, it made it worse. It forced me to confront how close that kind of violence can be without you realizing it. Before that incident, she had been sitting in rooms with people, laughing, talking, existing in a way that looked almost normal. The line between fine and life-threatening turned out to be terrifyingly thin. That experience alone shook me, but it wasn't the end of it. The same friend later introduced me to another person who, on the surface, seemed less dangerous. There were no violent outbursts, no obvious threats. Instead, the danger was quieter, slower, and in some ways more insidious. This person was a compulsive liar. At first, the lies were small enough to be brushed off. Exaggerated stories, dramatic anecdotes, Things that didn't quite add up but weren't worth challenging. Over time, though, the lies became bigger and more disturbing. They claimed to have had surgeries that never happened. They said they had attempted suicide. They claimed to have cancer, tumors, life-threatening illnesses that would mysteriously resolve or change when questioned. It wasn't just lying for attention. It was manipulation. This person would use their lies to control how people around them felt, to generate sympathy, to create guilt, to make others feel responsible for their emotional state. They would subtly try to turn people against each other, planting seeds of doubt, twisting conversations, isolating individuals from their support systems. It was calculated, even if it wasn't fully conscious. Being around them felt draining in a way that was hard to explain at first. You'd leave conversations feeling confused, guilty, or second-guessing your own memories. You'd wonder if you had said something wrong, even when you hadn't. Over time, it became clear that this wasn't accidental. It was a pattern. I recognized the danger and made a decision. I refused to have any form of contact with this person. I told my friend that they should do the same, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. I explained what I was seeing, how unhealthy and manipulative the behavior was, how damaging it could be long-term. My friend's response was simple and chilling in its own way. I don't abandon my friends. On the surface, that sounds noble, loyal, admirable. But there's a darker side to that mindset when it ignores reality. Loyalty without boundaries can become enabling. It can put other people at risk. It can prioritize the idea of being a good person over the responsibility to protect yourself and others. That response stayed with me. What scares me isn't just what happened with those two people. It's the broader implication. The realization that if I hadn't been aware, if I hadn't trusted my instincts, I could have been much closer to serious harm. I could have formed deeper bonds with someone capable of sudden violence, or allowed someone to slowly dismantle my mental health through manipulation and lies. The truly frightening part is the question that follows. What if next time? I don't know. What if I meet someone who seems completely normal, someone charming, friendly, engaging, and I have no idea they're struggling with delusions that could turn violent? What if I get close to someone who slowly rewrites reality around me, isolating me from friends and family without me even realizing it's happening? Those possibilities don't come with warning labels. Mental illness doesn't announce itself neatly. Manipulative behavior doesn't always look malicious at first. Compulsive liars don't start with obvious lies. They ease you into it. They normalize chaos. They make you question your own perceptions. And by the time you realize what's happening, you may already be deeply entangled. Violence, too, doesn't always come with clear signs. People like to believe they would notice if someone was dangerous, that there would be red flags waving clearly enough to avoid harm. But real life isn't that simple. Sometimes the signs are subtle. Sometimes they're explained away. Sometimes they're invisible until it's too late. That's what makes this scary to me. Not paranoia, not fear of people, but the understanding that closeness itself can be risky when information is incomplete. That trust, which is essential for human connection, can also be the thing that puts you in danger. It's also frightening how often people feel pressured to tolerate harmful behavior in the name of compassion. Mental illness is real and deserves understanding and care. But understanding doesn't mean exposure without consent. Care doesn't mean sacrificing your own safety or mental health. There's a difference between supporting someone and allowing them to harm you. Society doesn't talk enough about that difference. We're often taught that cutting someone off is cruel, that setting boundaries is selfish, that distancing yourself from troubled people makes you heartless. But experiences like this show the other side of that narrative. They show how ignoring your instincts, dismissing discomfort, or prioritizing loyalty over safety can have devastating consequences. The fear doesn't come from one knife or one lie. It comes from the endless possibilities, the unknowns, the realization that danger doesn't always look dangerous at first. That harm can come from people who are already inside your social circle, introduced by someone you trust. I don't live in constant fear because of this, but it has changed how I see things. I pay more attention to patterns now. I trust discomfort when it lingers. I don't feel guilty about stepping back when something feels wrong, even if I can't fully explain why. And I don't assume that knowing someone means knowing them completely. That's the part that sticks with me. The idea that safety is not just about avoiding strangers in dark alleys, but about recognizing when something is off in familiar spaces. About understanding that the people we let into our lives can shape our reality, for better or worse. The scary part isn't that these things happened. The scary part is knowing how easily they could happen again, quietly, without warning, if you're not paying attention. The kidnapping and murder of Amber Harris is one of those stories that never truly settles into the past. It doesn't fade with time, and it doesn't soften with distance. Even now, thinking about it brings back a heavy, uneasy feeling, because it wasn't just something that happened in a headline or on the evening news. It was close. It touched people I knew. It shaped the way a lot of adults and kids in our area understood safety, guilt, and the quiet weight of responsibility. Amber went missing in November of 2005. At first, it felt unreal the way missing child stories often do when you're young. You hear about them, but you assume they'll be found. You assume there will be a resolution that makes sense, something that restores order. Amber was only 12 years old. She was a middle school kid, the kind of age where you're still figuring out who you are, still halfway between childhood and whatever comes next. Her remains were found in July of 2006. By then, hope had already worn thin, replaced by dread. The confirmation didn't bring peace. It only made the loss permanent. At the time, my mom was a school bus driver. She had been driving for years and took her job seriously in a way that went beyond just following routes and schedules. She knew the kids by name. She knew their habits. She noticed when someone was quieter than usual or when something seemed off. Being a bus driver isn't just about driving. It's about being one of the first and last adults kids see every school day. Because of her job, my mom knew the driver who had Amber on his route. I was 10 years old then, and I often rode the bus with my mom. Sometimes it was because of timing, sometimes convenience, sometimes just because I liked being with her. School buses were familiar to me in a way they aren't to most kids. I understood the routines, the rules, the unspoken responsibilities that came with that role. Amber rode that bus every day. One detail about her story has never left me. On one of those days, Amber asked her bus driver if he could let her off at a different stop. It wasn't a dramatic request. Kids ask things like that all the time. Maybe she wanted a shorter walk. Maybe she wanted to avoid something. Maybe she just felt like changing things up. We'll never really know why. The driver told her no. He wasn't being cruel. He wasn't being dismissive. He was following the rules. Bus drivers are not allowed to change stops on a whim. Our routes and drop-off points exist for safety and accountability. Deviating from them can get a driver fired or worse. He did what he was trained to do. He did what he was supposed to do. Amber got off at her regular stop. She walked the same route she always walked, past the same houses, through the same neighborhood. Along that walk was a house belonging to the person who would later murder her. Someone she passed regularly. Someone who blended into the background of everyday life. Someone who didn't stand out as a threat until it was too late. That fact alone is terrifying. We grow up being told to watch out for strangers, but Amber didn't encounter a stranger in the way people imagine danger. She encountered someone familiar enough to be invisible, someone who existed in the routine of her day, unremarkable and unnoticed. When Amber disappeared, the shock rippled through the community. Parents tightened rules overnight. Kids were suddenly told not to walk alone. Neighborhoods that had once felt ordinary felt exposed. Adults looked at familiar streets with new suspicion. For the bus driver, the impact was devastating. He carried the weight of that moment with him, the memory of Amber asking to be let off somewhere else, and his refusal. Even though he did nothing wrong, even though he followed every rule, guilt doesn't care about logic, it doesn't care about policy or training manuals. It latches onto what-ifs and refuses to let go. What if he had said yes? What if he had made an exception just that once? What if she had taken a different route home? Those questions have no good answers, but they echo endlessly in the mind of someone who feels responsible, even when they aren't. He was never the same after Amber's death. The man who had once driven kids to school every day, keeping order on a loud yellow bus, slowly fell apart under the weight of it. The job became unbearable. Being around children, seeing kids the same age as Amber, hearing their voices, watching them get on and off the bus safely every day, all of it became too much. Eventually, he went on disability. He couldn't work anymore, not because he lacked skill or dedication, but because the emotional toll was too great. The job had become a constant reminder of a loss he could not undo, of a moment frozen in time that replayed itself again and again in his mind. That part of the story doesn't get talked about enough. We focus on the victim, as we should. Amber's life mattered. Her death was a tragedy. But there are other lives that get quietly broken in the aftermath of crimes like this. People who followed the rules, people who tried to do their jobs right, people who never intended harm but still carry its weight for the rest of their lives. For me, as a 10-year-old, this case changed how I saw the world. I understood for the first time that safety isn't guaranteed by routine, that rules, while important, can't protect against everything, that bad things don't always happen because someone made a clear mistake. Sometimes they happen because the world is unpredictable and cruel. It also changed how I saw adults. Adults were supposed to have answers. They were supposed to know what to do. But in the wake of Amber's disappearance and death, the adults around me were scared too. They were grieving. They were angry. They were questioning themselves. That realization was unsettling in a way I couldn't fully articulate at the time. The delay between Amber going missing and her remains being found made everything worse. Months passed with uncertainty hanging over the community. Every lead, every rumor, every potential sighting stirred hope and fear all at once. When her remains were finally found in July of 2006, it felt like the final blow. Not relief, just confirmation of the worst possible outcome. Amber was 12. She should have grown up. She should have gone to high school, complained about homework, argued with friends, dreamed about the future. All of that was taken away in a way that feels unbearably unfair. What haunts me most is how ordinary the day was when everything went wrong. A school day, a bus ride, a walk home. Nothing about it screamed danger. Nothing about it suggested that it would be her last normal day. That's what makes this story so frightening. Not because it was dramatic or sensational, but because it was quiet. Because it unfolded within routines we all trust. Because it shows how little control we sometimes have, even when we do everything right. The bus driver's story is a reminder of that, too. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. He followed protocol. He protected his job and the system designed to keep kids safe. And still, the outcome was catastrophic. There's a cruelty in that kind of randomness that's hard to accept. Years later, I still think about Amber. I think about her family, who had to live through months of uncertainty and then a lifetime of grief. I think about the bus driver, he carrying a burden that never belonged to him, but that he couldn't put down. I think about all the small moments that could have gone differently, but didn't. This case is scary, not because it's unusual, but because it isn't. It shows how danger can exist in familiar places, how harm can come from someone hiding in plain sight, how systems can fail not because they're careless, but because they can't account for every possibility. It also shows how deeply one moment can affect so many lives. A child lost, a family destroyed, a man unable to work again, a community forever changed, a 10-year-old kid learning too early that the world isn't as safe as it seems. That's why this story stays with me. Not as a true crime curiosity, but as a reminder of fragility, of how close we always are to tragedy without knowing it, of how the consequences of violence spread far beyond the immediate act, touching people who never expected to be part of the story at all. Amber was 12. She should still be here. And the fact that she isn't is something that will never stop being terrifying. On August 6, 1915, Osowiec Fortress sat under siege, and at first glance it looked like a situation that could only end one way. The fortress, located in what is now Poland, was old, battered, and surrounded. 14 battalions of German forces, led by Paul von Hindenburg, had been pressing against it. Inside the fortress were roughly 900 Russian defenders, exhausted, undersupplied, and cut off. By the standards of World War I warfare, this was already a grim scenario. But what happened next pushed it into something far more disturbing. Osowiec Fortress had been holding out longer than anyone expected. It wasn't a modern marvel. It wasn't especially comfortable or well protected by later standards. But it was stubborn, and so were the men inside it. For months they had endured shelling, shortages, and constant pressure, holding their ground against an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. To the German command, the fortress had become an irritation that needed to be removed decisively. Paul von Hindenburg decided to end the problem with a weapon that was still horrifyingly new at the time: chlorine gas. Chemical warfare was in its infancy during World War I, and its effects were not fully understood by either side. What was understood, however, was that chlorine gas was deadly. It attacked the lungs, the eyes, and the throat. It caused panic, confusion, and slow, painful death. When released in large enough quantities, it could clear trenches and fortifications without the need for direct combat. That morning, German forces released massive clouds of chlorine gas toward the fortress. Accounts differ slightly depending on the source, but what is consistent is that the Russian defenders were essentially defenseless against it. Either gas masks had not yet been developed for this unit, or they had not been issued in time. Whatever the reason, when the greenish-yellow cloud rolled toward them, they had no proper protection. The best they could do was soak rags in urine and tie them over their faces. This sounds almost absurd until you understand why. Urine contains ammonia, which can partially neutralize chlorine gas. It wasn't a solution. It was desperation. It might reduce the damage slightly, but it could not save anyone exposed for long. The gas swept through the fortress. Men began choking almost immediately. Their eyes burned. Their throats closed. Their lungs filled with fluid. Some collapsed within minutes. Others tried to flee, only to run headlong into the same poisonous cloud. Panic spread, but there was nowhere to go. Osowiec was surrounded, and the gas did not respect walls or trenches. By the time the gas cloud dissipated, most of the defenders were dead. Those who survived were barely alive. Chlorine gas doesn't kill quickly in all cases. Instead, it destroys lung tissue. It causes chemical burns inside the body. Victims cough violently, trying to breathe, trying to clear their airways, but instead, they cough up blood and pieces of damaged lung tissue. The phrase, coughing up your lungs, is usually just an exaggeration. In this case, it was horrifyingly literal. The German forces, confident that the gas had done its job, prepared to advance. They put on their gas masks, fixed their bayonets, and moved toward the fortress, expecting to encounter nothing more than corpses and maybe a few dying men. From their perspective, this was supposed to be a cleanup operation. The gas had wiped out resistance. The fortress would fall quietly. Instead, something unimaginable happened. From inside the fortress, around 100 to 150 Russian soldiers emerged. These were the survivors. They should not have been alive. Their uniforms were shredded. Their skin was burned and discolored. Their eyes were bloodshot and swollen. Blood ran from their mouths and noses as they coughed and gasped for air. Many were visibly wounded beyond anything that should allow movement, let alone combat. And yet, they charged. They didn't advance cautiously. They didn't try to hold defensive positions. They launched a full counterattack straight at the advancing German troops. Bayonets forward, rifles raised. Men screaming through ruined throats, coughing blood as they ran. From the German perspective, this must have looked like something out of a nightmare. They had just unleashed a weapon designed to annihilate all life in the fortress. They believed everyone inside was dead or dying. Instead, figures emerged from the gas and smoke that looked less like soldiers and more like walking corpses. Men who were visibly dying, who should not have been capable of standing, let alone charging. This moment became known as the attack of the dead men. The psychological impact was devastating. Even hardened soldiers trained for war are still human. Facing an enemy that looks already dead, bleeding from the mouth, coughing up pieces of themselves, yet still advancing with weapons, breaks something in the mind. Logic stops working. A fear takes over. German troops panicked. They broke formation. They retreated. Some fled outright. The attack that was supposed to end the siege turned into a chaotic withdrawal. The Russians, with bodies already failing them, had somehow forced a superior force to fall back simply by refusing to die quietly. The counterattack did not save the fortress in the long term. The Russian soldiers who charged that day did not survive much longer. Their injuries were catastrophic. Chlorine gas damage is not something the body recovers from easily, especially with the medical care available at the time. Many of them collapsed shortly after the attack. Others lingered, slowly suffocating as their lungs failed. Before they died, the remaining defenders destroyed the fortress. They burned what they could. They denied the Germans the victory of capturing it intact. If Osowiec was going to fall, it would fall on their terms. The fortress was rendered useless, a scorched shell rather than a prize. In the end, the Germans did take the position, but the cost was not what they had expected. The image of that counterattack stayed with those who witnessed it. It became a story passed along by soldiers, then historians, then generations later by people trying to understand just how brutal World War I really was. What makes this story so disturbing is not just the violence, but the sheer defiance of the human body and mind in extreme circumstances. These men were not fearless superheroes. They were in agony. They were dying. Their bodies were failing them in real time. And yet, something pushed them forward anyway. Some historians argue that the German retreat was less about physical danger and more about terror. The Russians, in that moment, represented something beyond normal warfare. They were living proof that chemical weapons did not guarantee control, that even death could be resisted long enough to strike back. It's also a stark reminder of how experimental and reckless early chemical warfare was. Chlorine gas was deployed without fully understanding its long-term effects, not just on enemies, but on anyone exposed. Winds could shift, gas could linger. It was a weapon that punished indiscriminately and cruelly. The defenders of Osowiec were not special forces. They were ordinary soldiers placed in an impossible situation. Their equipment failed them, their bodies failed them, and yet they acted. Oh, that is why this event still unsettles people today. It's not just about bravery. It's about desperation, suffering, and the terrifying capacities of humans to keep moving forward even when every system in their body is breaking down. It's about the horror of war stripped of any romantic language, reduced to choking lungs, burned eyes, and blood-soaked ground. When people talk about World War I as a uniquely brutal conflict, this is what they mean. Not grand strategies or famous victories, but moments like this, where technology outpaced morality and soldiers paid the price with their bodies. The attack of the dead men isn't scary because it sounds like a legend. It's scary because it actually happened. Because men really did rise from poison gas clouds, coughing up their own lungs, and charge an enemy who believed them already dead. It forces you to confront how thin the line is between life and death in war, and how fragile the human body becomes under chemical weapons. It also forces you to acknowledge something uncomfortable, that even in the face of certain death, people can still choose to fight. Not because they think they'll win, but because sometimes refusing to surrender is the last thing left. And that is the kind of horror that doesn't fade with time. This happened to me when I was about 12 years old. And even now, it's one of those memories that still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. At the time, I didn't really understand how close I had come to dying or being permanently injured. It wasn't until years later, after hearing other people describe what they saw and realizing what could have happened, that it truly hit me. Back then, it just felt like a terrifying accident that I was lucky to walk away from. Now it feels like a moment where everything could have ended very differently. My dad used to own several four-wheelers. He loved them, and so did we. We lived on a sizable piece of property, big enough that it felt like our own little world. There were open areas, rough patches, small hills, and long stretches where you could really pick up speed. For kids like us, it was heaven. We didn't see it as dangerous. We saw it as freedom. No traffic, no strangers, just land and machines and the feeling of being able to go wherever we wanted. My siblings and I spent countless hours riding those four-wheelers. We learned how to steer, how to brake, how to handle bumps and uneven ground. Over time, that familiarity turned into confidence. And confidence, especially in a 12-year-old, can quietly turn into recklessness. You start thinking you understand everything. You start believing that nothing bad is going to happen to you because it never has before. In the back of the property, there was a septic tank area. It was covered and solid, but the ground around it formed a kind of small rise. If you hit it at the right speed and angle, the four-wheeler would lift just enough to give you a brief moment of airtime. It wasn't a big jump, nothing like what you'd see in motocross videos, but to a kid, it felt exciting. It felt impressive. It felt like a challenge. We all knew about it. We all took turns riding over it. Most of the time, you just went straight, held on tight, and enjoyed that split second where the wheels weren't touching the ground. That should have been enough. But I was 12, and 12-year-olds are not known for good judgment. One day, I decided I wanted to try something extra. I don't even remember exactly what kind of trick I had in mind. It wasn't anything well thought out. There was no plan, no practice, no understanding of physics or consequences. It was just an idea that popped into my head in that impulsive way kids get ideas. And I thought I could shift my weight or move in a certain way during that moment in the air and make it look cool. I wanted to do something different, something that would make me feel skilled instead of just lucky. I lined up the four-wheeler and started riding toward the septic tank rise. I remember the sound of the engine, the vibration under my hands, the familiar feeling of speed. Everything felt normal right up until it didn't. As the four-wheeler lifted, I tried to move the way I had imagined. Instantly, I knew I had made a mistake. The balance was wrong. Instead of landing smoothly, the four-wheeler jerked. My body shifted too far to one side, and suddenly, I was no longer seated properly. I felt myself sliding. My heart jumped into my throat. Panic hit fast and hard, the kind that leaves no room for thinking, only reacting. I nearly fell off completely. The only thing that kept me from hitting the ground right away was my grip. My hands were still holding onto the handlebars, but the rest of my body was hanging off the side. My legs weren't where they were supposed to be. My weight was pulling me down and away from the machine, and I could feel my arms straining, trying desperately to hold on. The four-wheeler didn't stop. Because of the way my weight shifted, it turned. Instead of continuing forward across the property, it veered straight toward the side of the house. Everything happened incredibly fast, but in my memory, it feels stretched out, like time slowed down just enough for me to register how wrong everything was. The four-wheeler slammed into the side of the house. The front lifted and pressed against the wall, and for several seconds, it tried to climb it. The engine was still running, the back tires spinning, throwing dirt and making this horrible, loud noise. I was still hanging on, but my grip was failing. My arms were burning. I could feel myself losing strength second by second. As the four-wheeler strained against the house, I began to slide backward. It wasn't a clean fall. It was slow and awkward. My hands finally lost their grip, and I slipped off the side of the machine. I remember the feeling of my body dropping, the sudden loss of control, the shock of hitting the ground. The four-wheeler sputtered and then died, the engine cutting out as it settled back down. For a moment, I just lay there. I was breathing hard, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it was echoing in my ears. I didn't know if I was injured. I didn't know if something was broken. All I knew was that I was alive and that something very bad had almost happened. Family members came running. They had heard the noise and knew immediately that something was wrong. I remember their faces, pale and wide-eyed, the way adults look when they're trying not to panic in front of a child, but failing anyway. They checked me over, asking if I could move if I was hurt, if I had hit my head. Somehow, incredibly, I was mostly okay, shaken, sore, scared, but not seriously injured. At the time, I thought that was the end of it. I knew I had scared everyone. I knew I had done something stupid. I felt embarrassed and shaken, but I didn't fully understand how close the situation had come to being much worse. That understanding came later when family members talked about what they had seen. They told me something I hadn't realized in the moment. As I was sliding off the four-wheeler, my hair had been only a few inches away from the spinning axles of the back tires. The tires were still moving. The axles were exposed and spinning fast. If I had fallen just a little differently, if my head had been a little closer, my hair could have been caught instantly. If that had happened, I wouldn't have had time to react. Being scalped is not something you survive without severe, life-altering injury. In some cases, you don't survive it at all. The idea that my hair could have been pulled in and wrapped around those axles in seconds is something that still makes me feel cold when I think about it. There would have been blood. There would have been screaming. There would have been nothing anyone could do fast enough to stop it. All because I wanted to try a trick. All because I was a 12-year-old who thought he was invincible. That realization didn't fully sink in right away. At that age, your brain doesn't like to sit with those kinds of thoughts. It pushes them away. It tells you that it was just a close call, that everything turned out fine, so it's not worth dwelling on. But as I got older, the memory changed. I started replaying it differently. I started imagining what could have happened if the four-wheeler hadn't turned when it did. If I had fallen a second earlier or later. If my grip had lasted just a bit longer. If I had landed at a slightly different angle. The margin between walking away and being permanently disfigured or killed was terrifyingly small. It also made me think about how many similar moments happen without us realizing it. As kids, we take risks constantly without understanding them. We climb things we shouldn't. We ride too fast. We try stunts we've seen other people do without thinking about how controlled those situations really are. Most of the time, nothing happens. And because nothing happens, we assume nothing ever will. That day taught me, eventually, that survival doesn't mean safety. It means luck. I was lucky that my grip slipped when it did. I was lucky that the four-wheeler stalled. I was lucky that I fell away from the axles instead of toward them. I was lucky that the house stopped the machine instead of allowing it to keep moving. None of those things were guaranteed. None of them were things I controlled. For my family, that day stayed with them in a different way. They saw the whole thing from the outside. They saw a child hanging off a machine. I sliding toward something that could have killed him. They saw how close my head was to the spinning parts. They saw the aftermath and imagined what they almost had to witness. Parents and relatives carry those images longer than kids do. Looking back, I can see how that moment changed, how they treated risk afterward. There was more caution, more rules, more reminders, not because they wanted to control everything, but because they had seen firsthand how quickly fun could turn into tragedy. For me, it planted a seed. I didn't stop taking risks entirely. I didn't suddenly become overly cautious. But there was a new awareness underneath everything, a quiet understanding that things can go wrong without warning, and that confidence doesn't equal control. I started respecting machines more. I paid more attention to how things worked. I became more aware of where my body was in relation to danger. It also changed how I think about near-death experiences. People often imagine those as dramatic with flashing lights or profound realizations in the moment. Mine wasn't like that. It was messy, stupid, and rooted in childhood impulsiveness. The meaning came later, slowly, as I processed what I had been spared. The scariest part isn't the image of the accident itself. It's the idea that I didn't even know how close I was to something irreversible while it was happening. That I was seconds away from an outcome that would have changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone around me, and I was completely unaware of it in the moment. That kind of ignorance is terrifying in hindsight. Now, when I think about that day, I don't just think about fear. When I think about how fragile the line is between normal life and catastrophe. How a single bad decision, combined with a bit of bad luck, can alter everything. And how many times we walk that line without realizing it. I survived because nothing went wrong enough. That's not the same as being safe. And that understanding, more than the accident itself, is what stayed with me all these years later. Mrs. DuPont was known in her neighborhood as someone who was friendly, social, and very present in her own home. Neighbors later mentioned, again and again, that her blinds were almost always open. You could see lights on in the evenings, movement during the day, and the general signs of a family going about their normal routines. It was the kind of house that felt lived in, observed, and connected to the street around it. That visibility is part of what made the silence that followed so unsettling. One day, the blinds and curtains were suddenly closed. At first, that alone didn't seem alarming. People closed their blinds for all kinds of reasons. But then the mail started to pile up. Days passed. Then more days. The house stayed closed off, quiet and unchanged. No one saw the family leave. No one saw them return. The dogs, unusually noticeable, were nowhere to be heard. Eventually, neighbors became concerned enough to call the police. When officers arrived and searched the home, they didn't immediately find anything that screamed danger. There were no obvious signs of a struggle. Furniture was in place. Personal belongings were still there. The only thing that seemed slightly off was that the sheets were missing from the beds. The family was gone. The dogs were gone. But nothing looked disturbed in the way people expect after a crime. To the police, at least initially, it didn't look like a crime scene. Around the same time, family members and friends began receiving a letter. The letter was written by Xavier, the father and husband. It claimed that the family had gone to America. According to the letter, they were involved in secret work, acting as undercover spies for the DEA. It explained the sudden disappearance, the lack of contact, and the strange silence. It asked people not to look for them, not to ask questions, and to trust that everything was under control. On paper, it was an explanation. In reality, it raised more questions than it answered. Those close to the family knew something wasn't right. The story didn't fit who they were or how they lived. The idea that an entire family, including children, would suddenly disappear into a secret international operation made no sense. As pressure mounted from relatives and friends, the French police returned to the house and searched again. Once more, they found nothing obvious. Weeks passed. Then, on April 21st, 2011, police conducted yet another search of the property. This time, something small but crucial caught an officer's attention. There was something off about the terrace. The ground didn't look quite right. It was subtle, the kind of detail that could easily be missed if you weren't already looking closely. When they investigated further, they made the discovery that changed everything. Beneath the terrace, wrapped carefully in bags, were the bodies of Mrs. DuPont, 4 of the children, and the family's 2 dogs. Religious icons had been placed with them. The scene was controlled, deliberate, and chilling in its quiet order. There was no visible blood, no signs of panic, no fingerprints, no usable DNA that could clearly identify who had committed the murders. The absence of chaos made it worse. As the investigation unfolded, the focus turned to Xavier. Evidence began to suggest that he had planned the killings carefully. Financial records revealed that he was essentially bankrupt. His life, built on appearances and status, was collapsing. Rather than face the humiliation of admitting failure, of telling his family that the money was gone and the life they knew could not continue, investigators believe he chose annihilation instead. He didn't just kill them. He staged their disappearance. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was how long it took for the victims to be found. The delay allowed the false narrative to spread and gave Xavier time to vanish. It also meant that the reality of what had happened remained hidden beneath a perfectly ordinary-looking home for weeks. Even more horrifying was what happened to the oldest child. That child was away at college when the rest of the family was killed. Xavier contacted him, claiming there was an emergency and asking him to come home. When the child returned, trusting his father, he was drugged and killed as well. The level of manipulation involved in that act is difficult to comprehend. It required patience, deception, and an absolute willingness to destroy his own family one by one. After the murders, Xavier disappeared. Despite sightings, tips, and international attention, he has never been found. Some believe he committed suicide. Others believe he is still alive, living under a new identity somewhere in the world. The uncertainty adds another layer of fear to the story. There is no body, no confirmation, no closure. What makes this case especially terrifying isn't just the crime itself, but the way it unfolded in silence. A family vanished in plain sight. Neighbors noticed something was off, but nothing immediately screamed danger. Authorities searched the house multiple times without realizing what was literally beneath their feet. It forces you to confront how easily evil can hide behind normalcy. This wasn't a chaotic act committed in a moment of rage. It was methodical. It was planned. It involved letters, staging, religious symbolism, and a complete erasure of a family's future. The lack of physical evidence, the careful disposal of the bodies, and the calm presentation of the scene all point to someone who wanted control until the very end. It also highlights how devastating pride and fear of exposure can be when combined with financial ruin. Instead of asking for help, instead of admitting failure, a man chose to erase everyone who depended on him. That kind of thinking is deeply unsettling because it can exist anywhere, behind closed doors in families that appear loving and stable from the outside. The fact that Mrs. DuPont was known for keeping her blinds open makes the story even darker. It's as if openness and visibility offered no protection at all. One day, the house simply closed itself off from the world, and no one realized in time what that meant. The unanswered questions linger. Did Xavier plan to escape from the beginning, or did he intend to die afterward? Did he feel guilt, or did he justify his actions completely in his own mind? How did he manage to disappear so thoroughly in a modern world filled with surveillance, records, and digital footprints? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this: how many times did people look at that house, walk past it, or even enter it, without realizing what was hidden beneath it? The story remains one of the most chilling modern family annihilation cases because it combines patience, deception, and absence. Absence of noise, absence of evidence, absence of answers. Whether Xavier is dead or alive, the damage is complete. An entire family was erased, not by a stranger, but by the person who was supposed to protect them. And the world only learned the truth long after it was too late. That quiet delay, the normal-looking house, the letter full of lies, and the knowledge that the killer may never be found are what make this case truly frightening. It shows that sometimes the most terrifying crimes are not the loudest ones, but the ones that unfold slowly, silently, and right in front of everyone without being seen. The Barari deaths are one of those stories that stay heavy in your mind long after you first hear about them. Not because of gore or chaos, but because of how quiet, organized, and ordinary everything appeared on the surface. It is frightening in a slow, creeping way, the kind of fear that grows the more you think about it. This happened in 2018 in Barari, a neighborhood in Delhi, India, and it involved 11 members of the same family. What made it so disturbing was not only the number of people who died, but the way they died, and the belief system that seemed to guide them to it. On the morning of July 1st, 2018, neighbors noticed something strange at the Chundawat family home. The house was usually active early in the day. People came and went. The family ran a shop and were well known in the area. That morning, everything was quiet. The door was closed. No one answered when neighbors called out. Eventually, the police were informed and the house was entered. Inside, they found a scene that was difficult to comprehend. 10 family members were found hanging in the courtyard hallway of the house. They were suspended from a metal mesh attached to the ceiling. They were close together, almost aligned, as if arranged. Their faces were covered with cloth. Their eyes were blindfolded. Cotton was stuffed into their ears. Their mouths were sealed with tape. Many of their hands were tied behind their backs, and some of their feet were bound as well. Beneath them were 5 stools, suggesting that some of them had shared support before stepping off. In another room, away from the others, the oldest member of the family, 77-year-old Narayani Devi, was found dead on a bed. Unlike the others, she was not hanging. She appeared to have been strangled. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no suicide note in the traditional sense. Instead, there were notebooks. As the investigation continued, police uncovered a series of diaries that completely changed how the case was understood. These diaries had been written over several years by Lalit Chundawat, one of the family members. The entries described detailed instructions for rituals, behaviors, and beliefs that the family had been following. According to Lali, these instructions were not his own ideas. He believed he was being guided by the spirit of his deceased father. Lalit's father, Bhopal Singh, had died in 2007 of natural causes. After his death, the family noticed a shift in Lalit. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He spent long periods praying. He began performing rituals that others did not fully understand. At first, these behaviors were seen as grief, devotion, or spirituality. In many cultures, deep mourning and religious practice after a parent's death are not unusual. No one immediately saw it as dangerous. Over time, Lalit claimed that his father's soul had begun communicating with him. According to him, his father was not gone, but guiding the family from another realm. He said his father told him how to live a good life, how to protect the family, and how to solve their problems. The family trusted him. They believed him. He was seen as devoted, spiritual, and responsible. From 2013 onward, Lalit documented these instructions in diaries. The entries were precise. They described daily rituals, rules for behavior, and promises of reward if everything was done correctly. The writing suggested that if the family followed these steps faithfully, they would be protected from harm, financial troubles would be resolved, and their lives would improve. What is chilling is that many of the diary entries described practices that matched what was found at the scene. Instructions about covering eyes and ears, instructions about silence, instructions about positioning bodies, instructions about surrender and trust. Some entries suggested that the act was not meant to be death, but a spiritual test. There were mentions of temporary suffering, followed by awakening or salvation. Police concluded that the deaths were a mass suicide, driven by shared psychosis, also known as folie à plusieurs. This is a condition where delusional beliefs are transmitted from one person to others, especially within close-knit groups like families. In this case, Lilith appeared to be the primary source of the belief system, and the rest of the family accepted it over time. That acceptance is one of the most unsettling parts of the story. This was not a family living on the margins of society. They were educated, financially stable, socially connected. Neighbors described them as polite, religious, and normal. There were no obvious signs of abuse or extreme isolation. From the outside, they looked like any other household. And yet, inside the home, an alternate reality had slowly taken shape. The family's trust in Lalit and their reverence for the deceased patriarch created a closed belief loop. Questions were not asked, or if they were answered within the same framework of faith and obedience. Over time, the line between spiritual ritual and self-destruction blurred. The fact that the grandmother was found strangled separately raised additional questions. Some believe she may not have been physically capable of hanging herself, or that she may not have been part of the ritual in the same way as the others. This detail adds another layer of discomfort, because it suggests the possibility that not everyone fully understood or agreed with what was happening, even if the overall conclusion remains mass suicide. The physical arrangement of the bodies was haunting. 10 people, standing on stools close together, faces covered with cloth cut from a single bedsheet. This detail alone implies planning, cooperation, and calm. There was no chaos, no overturned furniture, no blood. It was almost ceremonial. That calmness is what makes the case so difficult to process. People often imagine suicide as an act of despair, panic, or emotional collapse. The Barari deaths did not look like that. They looked deliberate, structured, almost peaceful on the surface. And that contrast makes the underlying reality even more disturbing. The diary suggested that the family believed they would survive the ritual, that the hanging was not meant to kill them, but to lead them to a higher state of existence. This belief reframes the event in a tragic way. They were not running from life. They believed they were stepping into something better. This is where the idea of shared psychosis becomes crucial. Shared psychosis thrives in environments where authority, trust, and emotional dependence are strong. Lalit was seen as a conduit to their father's spirit, a figure of respect and guidance. Questioning him may have felt like questioning their father, their faith, or their family unity. Over time, skepticism eroded, replaced by belief. Mental health experts who analyzed the case emphasized how easily such belief systems can develop when grief, religion, family hierarchy, and isolation overlap. The family reinforced each other's beliefs, unintentionally creating a closed system where doubts were filtered out. What also makes this case frightening is how invisible the warning signs were to the outside world. Neighbors did not report screams, fights, or extreme behavior. The family continued their routines. They ran their business. They attended social events. They appeared functional. This challenges the assumption that mental health crises are always obvious. Sometimes they are hidden behind smiles, rituals, and routines that appear normal or even admirable. In some cultures, intense spirituality is respected, not questioned. That respect can unintentionally shield dangerous beliefs from scrutiny. The Barari deaths sparked massive public discussion in India and beyond. People debated whether it was suicide, murder, or something in between. They questioned how an entire family could be led to such an end. They argued about religion, mental health care, and the responsibility of communities to notice warning signs. At its core, the case exposed how fragile reality can become when belief overrides critical thinking. It also highlighted the gaps in mental health awareness. Lalit's behavior after his father's death was a clear sign of unresolved grief and possible delusion. But without education and access to mental health support, those signs were interpreted as spirituality rather than illness. Another deeply unsettling aspect is the involvement of children and teenagers. Two of the victims were teenagers. They trusted the adults around them. They followed instructions given by elders. In family systems, especially traditional ones, obedience is often emphasized. That obedience, in this case, became deadly. The story forces uncomfortable questions. How many families quietly operate within belief systems that isolate them from reality? How often do grief and faith merge in ways that go unchallenged? How many warning signs are overlooked because they don't look dramatic or violent? The Barari deaths are not frightening because they are mysterious in a supernatural sense. They are frightening because they are human. They show how love, trust, and devotion can be twisted by untreated mental illness into something catastrophic. There was no external monster in this story, no stranger, no break-in, no chaos. The danger came from within the family, wrapped in belief, ritual, and obedience. Even years later, the image of 10 people hanging together, faces covered, bodies aligned, remains deeply disturbing. Not because it looks like a crime scene, but because it looks like a ceremony that went terribly wrong. This case is often remembered as a reminder that mental health is as important as physical health, and that belief systems, when left unquestioned, can become prisons rather than sources of comfort. The Barari deaths do not offer easy answers. They leave behind grief, confusion, and fear. Fear not of cults or strangers, but of how easily ordinary people can slip into extraordinary tragedy without anyone noticing until it is far too late. That is what makes this story so hard to forget. It does not scream. It whispers. And in that whisper is a warning about how fragile the human mind can be when left alone with grief, authority, and unquestioned belief. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.